I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't fight back. I simply let them hang themselves with the network cables I had secretly unplugged long ago. They replaced me with a Gen Z star wearing a hoodie and carrying an unsaved Excel spreadsheet. And on Black Friday morning, the system they thought they had modernized began to devour itself from within. All I had to do was watch, sipping my tea, with my $2 million consulting price tag ready. My name is Lillian Moore, and after dedicating 2 decades of my life to Bravian retail systems, I found myself cleaning out my desk on a dreary November afternoon. 20 years of service ended with a cardboard box and a scripted speech about restructuring for technological advancement. I was 46 years old, the senior financial control specialist who had built their entire logistical finance system, what we called the Ledger Engine, from the ground up. "We appreciate your years of dedicated service," Tom Harrington said, not meeting my eyes as he recited the corporate platitudes. He was the CFO, and once upon a time, we'd been friends. We'd started at Bravian within months of each other. Now he sat across from me, his eyes fixed on the severance paperwork as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "But the company is moving in a new direction. We need systems that leverage modern cloud infrastructure and AI capabilities." What Tom meant, but couldn't say, was that I was too old, too expensive, and too set in my ways. The new CEO, Warren Blackwell, had come from a tech startup and wanted to purge anything that seemed legacy. And I, despite my impeccable record, was the very definition of legacy. Standing in the doorway, practically bouncing on his heels, was my replacement, Zach Thompson, maybe 26 years old, wearing what I'm sure he thought was professional attire, dark jeans, a blue blazer over a graphic t-shirt, and that perpetually tousled hair that must take an hour to look so effortlessly messy. He had been shadowing me for 2 weeks under the guise of cross-training, asking superficial questions about the Ledger Engine while regularly mentioning his game-changing ideas. "I'm an automation evangelist," he told me on his first day, sliding his MacBook Air across the table to show me a dashboard he'd created. "See, I've already mocked up how we could visualize the entire system." I had nodded, not bothering to tell him that his beautiful dashboard missed about 70% of the system's critical functions. The Ledger Engine wasn't just accounting software. It was the central nervous system of Bravian's entire operation, a complex web of inventory management, vendor payments, price adjustments, promotional scheduling, and tax compliance across 50 states. I had built it piece by piece over 2 decades, adapting legacy code, creating workarounds for incompatible systems acquired during mergers, and implementing fail-safes that had saved the company millions. But Zach had watched some YouTube tutorials and taken a weekend course on Python. Clearly, he knew better. I didn't argue as Tom slid the severance papers across the desk. I didn't remind him of the time in 2017 when I stayed awake for 72 hours straight to prevent a catastrophic tax miscalculation that would have cost them $4.3 million in penalties. I didn't mention how, during the ransomware scare of 2020, it was my backup systems that kept Bravian operational while competitors were crippled for weeks. Instead, I signed where indicated, stood up, and smiled. "I've prepared comprehensive documentation," I said, handing Tom a neatly labeled flash drive. "Everything Zach will need is there." Tom looked relieved. Zach looked smug. Neither of them knew that what I had prepared was a masterpiece of misdirection flowcharts that looked impressive, but omitted critical logic gates, macros that would trigger subtle errors when certain conditions were met, and directory paths that led nowhere. Most importantly, neither of them knew about the manual override that needed to be activated every Black Friday, Bravian's most profitable day of the year. This hidden function, buried in a folder called Do Not Delete, Lil, Notes, Legacy, Nightmare, had to be manually triggered to handle the surge in transactions without crashing the system. It wasn't pretty code, but it was necessary because of how the system had evolved over 2 decades. I had documented it nowhere. As I walked out of Bravian's glass headquarters for the last time, carrying my small box of personal effects, I felt strangely light. For 20 years, my phone had never been silent. My weekends never truly free. There was always some emergency, some glitch, some executive who needed numbers reconfigured to tell a different story. Now, for the first time since my 20s, I was untethered. I drove home in silence. No radio, no calls, just the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional rustle of falling leaves. My house, a modest colonial I'd bought during the recession and barely had time to furnish, seemed to welcome me with a puzzled air, as if wondering why I was home at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I set my box down on the kitchen counter and looked at the contents: a few framed certificates, a dying plant that had somehow survived on fluorescent light and neglect, a coffee mug from the company's 15th anniversary celebration, and a photo of my son, Marcus, at his high school graduation, an event I had missed due to an emergency audit. He hadn't forgiven me for that. At 24, he now lived in Colorado. Our communications limited to occasional texts and obligatory holiday calls. I poured myself a glass of wine, an indulgence I rarely allowed on weekdays, and stepped onto my back porch. The yard was overgrown. The garden beds I'd ambitiously installed 5 years ago now choked with weeds. In my peripheral vision was the stack of renovation magazines I'd been collecting, full of projects I'd never had time to start. My phone buzzed. A text from Camille Peterson, one of the few genuine friends I had at Bravian. She worked in compliance, and we'd bonded over being two of the few women over 40 in leadership roles. Just heard, those bastards, drinks tonight. I typed back, rain check, need some quiet, call you tomorrow. What I needed wasn't drinks or sympathy. What I needed was to watch the clock tick down to Black Friday, now just 8 days away. I took another sip of wine and allowed myself a small smile. The next morning felt surreal. For the first time in 2 decades, I didn't wake to the insistent buzz of my alarm at 5:30 a.m. Instead, I drifted into consciousness naturally as sunlight filtered through blinds I couldn't remember closing. It was past 8 nowhere score. I made coffee, real coffee, not the rushed instant variety I usually gulped down and took it outside. The November air was crisp, but not unpleasant. I sat on my neglected porch swing and watched the neighborhood come alive, kids catching school buses, people walking dogs, the rhythm of suburban life I'd been adjacent to but never fully part of. My phone rang. It was Tom. I let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it rang again. I ignored it. The third time, I picked up. Lillian. Tom's voice had an edge of panic. There seems to be an issue with the quarterly projection model. The numbers aren't matching up. I took a slow sip of coffee. Have you asked Zach? I'm sure your automation evangelist can figure it out. He's working on it. Tom hedged. But I thought maybe you could point us in the right direction, as a courtesy. A courtesy, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us. Like the courtesy of 2 weeks' notice or the courtesy of an honest explanation for my termination. Lillian, please, this is time-sensitive. The board meeting is at 2 p.m. I know the schedule, Tom. I've only been keeping it for 20 years. I paused, savoring the moment. My consulting rate is $500 per hour, with a 3-hour minimum, payable in advance. There was silence on the line. Then, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious in my life. Good luck with your meeting. I hung up and returned to my coffee, which tasted even better than before. By noon, there were 3 more missed calls from various Bravian executives, 2 voicemails, and an email from HR asking if I could pop in for a quick session to tie up some loose ends. I ignored them all. Instead, I went to the garden center and bought seedlings, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I spent the afternoon with my hands in the soil, planting a row of herbs along my porch railing. The feel of the dirt under my fingernails was foreign but satisfying. That evening, I called Marcus. He seemed surprised to hear from me on a weekday. Everything okay, Mom? He asked, suspicion edging his voice. I got fired, I said, deciding on blunt honesty. There was a pause. Shit, really, after all this time? Yep, replaced by a kid who thinks he can reinvent 20 years of work with an app. Marcus laughed. a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time. Well, that's corporate America for you. You okay? Oddly enough, yes, I planted basil today. You gardening now I know the world's ending. We talked for almost an hour longer than we had in years. He told me about his job teaching high school physics, about a girl he'd been seeing, about a hiking trip he was planning. I listened, asking questions, present in a way I hadn't been since he was small. Before hanging up, he hesitated, then said, "Hey, I was thinking of coming east for Thanksgiving. Would that be okay?" My heart skipped. I'd like that very much. Cool, and mom their loss, seriously. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet living room, the severance package untouched on my coffee table. I pulled out my laptop, not the company one I'd returned, but my personal device, and checked the calendar. 8 days until Black Friday. 7 days until the system would need its manual override. I wondered if Zach had even discovered the folder yet. Probably not. He'd be too busy redesigning interfaces and creating dashboards to dig into the actual infrastructure. Tom wouldn't think to ask. He'd always left the technical details to me. And none of the IT team would know. The ledger engine had always been my domain, kept intentionally separate from their systems to maintain financial controls. I closed my laptop and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in years. The next week passed in a strange new rhythm. I established a morning routine: coffee on the porch, a walk around the neighborhood, tending to my new herb garden. I baked bread from scratch, something I'd watched countless YouTube videos about but never attempted. I called old friends I'd lost touch with, read a novel I'd bought 3 years ago, and started clearing out my cluttered garage. Bravian continued to call. The tone of the messages grew increasingly desperate. On Tuesday, I received an email from Zach himself, the first direct communication since my departure. "Hey Lillian," it began, with infuriating casualness. "Hope you're enjoying some well-deserved rest. Quick question: do you recall any special procedures for high-volume processing? We're stress testing for Black Friday and seeing some bottlenecks." I didn't reply. On Wednesday, Camille called. "It's chaos," she reported with a mixture of horror and glee. "Zach keeps insisting he's got everything under control, but the test runs are failing spectacularly. Tom looks like he hasn't slept in days." "How tragic," I murmured, trimming my basil plants. "They're going to call you," she predicted. "How much are you going to charge them?" I told her my plan. She gasped, then laughed so hard she snorted. "You magnificent bitch," she said admiringly. "I want to be you when I grow up." "I'll teach you everything I know," I promised. On Thursday, Thanksgiving, Marcus arrived. We cooked together, something we'd never done before. He was surprisingly adept in the kitchen, teaching me techniques he'd learned from roommates and girlfriends over the years. We talked about his students, about books we'd read, about places we wanted to travel. We carefully avoided the years of missed recitals, forgotten birthdays, and the graduation ceremony where he'd scanned the audience repeatedly for a face that never appeared. But as we ate our slightly overcooked turkey, he looked at me thoughtfully. "You know what's weird? You seem happier now, after being fired, than I can remember seeing you. Maybe ever." I considered this. "I think I might be. Isn't that strange?" "Not really. That place sucked the life out of you." "Mom, I used to think you loved it more than—" He stopped abruptly. "More than you," I finished softly. He shrugged, suddenly interested in his mashed potatoes. "I never loved that job more than you, Marcus. I just got lost in it. It became my identity. I thought I was indispensable. And now I know better. And I'm working on being a person instead of just an employee." He nodded, and though nothing was fully resolved, something had shifted between us. A door that had been firmly closed was now, at least, slightly ajar. That night, after Marcus had gone to bed in his old room, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Tom, 2 from Warren himself, and an email from HR with urgent consulting opportunity in the subject line. I smiled and turned off my phone. Tomorrow was Black Friday. I woke at 4:30 a.m. Not because of an alarm, but because my body was conditioned after years of early morning crisis management on this particular day. Marcus was still asleep. I made coffee and took my laptop to the porch. Despite the pre-dawn chill, I knew exactly how it would unfold at Bravian. The first online orders would have started trickling in at midnight, building steadily through the early hours. By 5 a.m., the volume would be increasing significantly as East Coast shoppers woke up. And at some point, probably around 5:17 a.m., based on past patterns, the first transaction would be incorrectly recorded due to an uncleaned cache memory. One error would become 2. 2 would become 10. By 6 a.m., the system would be generating phantom inventory adjustments. By 7:30, customers would begin receiving multiple charges for single purchases. By 8:45, the customer service lines would be overwhelmed, and by 10 a.m., the PR nightmare would be in full swing. I sipped my coffee and waited. At 6:22 a.m., my phone lit up with a text from Camille. It's starting. Duplicate transaction logs appearing. At 7:45, customer service is getting slammed. Error rate at 17% and climbing. At 9:12, emergency meeting in the war room. Zach keeps saying he's identified the problem, but nothing's working. At 10:37, oh God, it's on Twitter. Bravian fails is trending. I went inside and turned on the news. Sure enough, on the business ticker at the bottom of the screen, retail giant Bravian faces Black Friday system meltdown. Stock down 7% in early trading. Marcus emerged from his room, bleary-eyed but smiling. Happy leftover turkey day. He yawned, then noticed my expression. What's up? I gestured to the TV. My former employer is having a bad day. He squinted at the screen, then back at me. His eyes widened. Mom, did you... I didn't do anything, I said truthfully. I just didn't prevent the inevitable. He stared at me for a long moment, then slowly grinned. You're kinda scary, you know that. I prefer strategic. We made breakfast, and I checked my phone periodically for updates from Camille. 11:28 a.m. Warren is losing his mind. Keeps asking why nobody knew about this vulnerability. 12:15 p.m. Zach locked himself in the server room. Rumor is he's crying. 1:40 p.m. Estimated losses already at $8 million in counting. Tom just threw up in a trash can. By mid-afternoon, Marcus and I were working on a puzzle together another first when my phone rang. It was Warren Blackwell himself, the CEO who had orchestrated my removal. I showed Marcus the screen. Are you going to answer it? He asked. Not yet, I replied, fitting another piece into place. They're not desperate enough. My phone continued to ring throughout the day. Tom, HR, even the company's general counsel. I let each call go to voicemail, each message more frantic than the last. As evening approached, Marcus and I heated up leftovers and watched a movie, something we'd rarely done when he was growing up. My phone buzzed with a text from Camille. They're saying $18 million in losses now. Emergency board call at 9 p.m. I checked the time, 7:32 p.m. Almost there, I murmured. Almost where? Marcus asked. Rock bottom, I said. That's when they'll be ready to pay what I'm worth. At 11:54 p.m., as Black Friday was drawing to a close on the West Coast, my phone rang again. Warren Blackwell. This time, I answered. Lillian speaking. Lillian. Warren's voice trembled slightly. The arrogance that had characterized our few previous interactions was nowhere to be heard. We have a situation. So I've heard. We need your help, urgently. I let the silence stretch uncomfortably before responding. I'm listening. Whatever it takes, he said, the words clearly painful for him. Name your price. Are you sure you want to give me that power? Warren. You seemed quite convinced last week that my contributions were, what was the phrase, technologically outdated and prohibitively inefficient. He made a sound that might have been a suppressed groan. I was misinformed. Please. We're hemorrhaging money by the minute. My consulting fee is $2 million, I said calmly. Payable immediately. There was a choked sound on the other end. 2 mil? That's extortion. No, Warren. That's the market rate for preventing a complete collapse of your company. But I have other conditions as well. What conditions? He asked warily. First, Zach and Tom are to be terminated immediately. No transfers to other departments. No stepping down. Fired. Done, he said without hesitation, which told me exactly how badly things had gone. Second, you will send a company-wide email acknowledging that my termination was a mistake and that my replacement was catastrophically underqualified. Lillian, those exact words, Warren, catastrophically underqualified, I wanted in writing. He sighed heavily. Fine. Third, I will not be returning as an employee. Instead, you will retain me as a permanent consultant. 5 hours per month, $20,000, adjusted annually for inflation. $20,000 for 5 hours, he spluttered. Think of it as insurance, Warren. Very, very good insurance. There was a long pause. Is that all? One last thing. This is not a negotiation. You called me. You're out of moves. Do we have a deal? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, we have a deal. Excellent. I'll expect the money in my account and the contract in my email within the hour. Once those are confirmed, I'll explain how to stabilize the system. I hung up and looked at Marcus, who had been listening with undisguised amazement. Holy shit, Mom, he whispered. That was badass. I smiled, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and something that felt suspiciously like joy. Want some ice cream? I think this calls for a celebration. Exactly 53 minutes later, my phone pinged with notifications a deposit of $2 million to my account and an email containing a signed consulting agreement with exactly the terms I had specified. There was also a draft of the company-wide email for my approval, with the phrase catastrophically underqualified featured prominently. I sat down at my laptop, connected remotely to Bravian's system using my still active emergency credentials, another oversight, and typed exactly 3 commands that would temporarily stabilize the ledger engine. It wouldn't fix everything, they'd still have significant cleanup to do, but it would stop the bleeding. I didn't, however, implement a permanent solution. Nor did I explain the underlying architectural issues that had caused the meltdown. Those would be covered in my 5-hour monthly consulting sessions, doled out carefully to ensure they never fully understood the system well enough to replace me again. Some might call it vindictive. I preferred to think of it as job security. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. Marcus had gotten up early and was making breakfast. So, he said, sliding a plate of slightly burnt toast in front of me. What are you going to do with $2 million? I considered the question. First, I'm going to renovate this house. It's been neglected for too long. Just like other parts of my life, I didn't add. And then? I'm not sure, I admitted. For 20 years, I've been too busy working to think about what I actually want. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Well, you've got time to figure it out now. Yes, I agreed, feeling the truth of it settle comfortably around me. I do. After breakfast, I walked Marcus to his car. He hesitated before getting in, then gave me an awkward hug. That was the best Thanksgiving we've had in, maybe ever, he said. Next time, maybe you could stay longer. I suggested. I hear Christmas is nice in the East. He smiled. I'd like that. As his car disappeared down the street, I returned to my porch and sat on the swing, nursing a fresh cup of coffee. My phone buzzed with an email notification, a news alert about Bravian's stock dropping 12% following their Black Friday technical difficulties. I set the phone aside and looked at my small herb garden, the basil and thyme already showing new growth. For the first time in 2 decades, my time was truly my own. No emergency calls, no weekend audits, no middle-of-the-night system crashes. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. It tasted like freedom. In the days that followed, I began reimagining my life. I consulted with a contractor about renovating my long-neglected home, focusing first on creating a sunroom where I could expand my gardening experiments through the winter. I reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with, started swimming at the local rec center, and enrolled in a cooking class. Camille called with regular updates about the aftermath at Bravian. As promised, Zach and Tom had been escorted from the building the Monday after Black Friday. The company-wide email from Warren had gone out, prompting a flood of messages from former colleagues, some gloating on my behalf, others asking if I could put in a good word for them with the new regime. The final tally of losses from the Black Friday meltdown was just over $23 million, not including the hit to their stock price and the immeasurable damage to their reputation. Tech blogs had a field day with the story of the retail giant brought to its knees by its own hubris. For my first consulting session in December, I arrived at Bravian's headquarters wearing a tailored suit and heels that cost more than I would have spent in my employee days. The receptionist knew since my departure directed me to the executive conference room, where Warren and the new interim CFO waited nervously. "Lillian," Warren greeted me, his smile strained. "Thank you for coming in." I set my designer briefcase on the table. "My pleasure." For the next 5 hours, I walked them through the absolute minimum they needed to know to keep the system functioning until the next month. I answered their questions with technical explanations, just complex enough to sound comprehensive while revealing almost nothing of value. Warren, to his credit, seemed to understand the new power dynamic perfectly. He was respectful, even deferential, asking for my opinion on potential system upgrades and new hire qualifications for the still vacant financial control position. At the end of the session, as I was preparing to leave, he asked hesitantly, "Same time next month?" I smiled pleasantly. "I'll have my assistant coordinate with yours." I didn't have an assistant, of course, but the look on his face as he realized I now occupied the same social stratum as he did was worth the small deception. As I walked out of the building that had consumed 2 decades of my life, I felt no nostalgia. No sense of loss, only a calm certainty that I had finally set appropriate boundaries. I had given Bravian 20 years of dedication and received in return a dismissal based on age and a misguided faith in youth and novelty. Now, the scales were balanced. Some might say I was harsh, even cruel, in my revenge. Perhaps. But in a world where loyalty is rewarded with disposability, where experience is devalued in favor of the illusion of innovation, sometimes the only language corporations understand is their own, the bottom line. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't fight back. I simply let them discover my true value in my absence. And in that absence, I discovered something far more valuable: the person I'd set aside for 20 years, waiting patiently to emerge when given the chance. As I drove home, I made a mental note to call Marcus about Christmas plans. My new sunroom would be finished by then, the perfect place for a tree, with plenty of light and room for presents. Perhaps I'd even try my hand at those complicated cookies he'd loved as a child. For the first time in memory, I had no urgent emails to check, no system alerts to monitor, no weekend work to prepare for, just the open road ahead, and the freedom to choose which turn to take next. I smiled, turned up the radio, and drove toward home, not just the building where I lived, but the life I was finally, properly beginning to build. After 20 years of servitude to a corporation that discarded me without a second thought, I had found something I'd forgotten existed: the luxury of time, the gift of choice, and the sweet, sweet satisfaction of watching them realize too late exactly what they had lost. It wasn't revenge, not really. It was simply the natural consequence of underestimating a woman who had spent 20 years anticipating every possible system failure, including, as it turned out, their failure to value what had been right in front of them all along.